everyone, to the HealthyU podcast. My name is Dawn Funk, your host, coming to you down here from sunny Florida. And I'm so excited to be joining you guys again today. We've got, as always, an amazing guest speaker who's going to be pouring tons of value and wisdom into you today. And I'm so excited because today's extra special for a couple reasons. One, the speaker that we have has the same last name as me. And that is the coolest thing ever. And we're not related, although we were just chit-chatting before the show today. And she swears that she may know my husband. So that's kind of cool. They're both from a little town in Ohio. So who knows? Maybe they're distant cousins or something. It's kind of crazy. And the other cool thing is she actually lived in Florida. If you're watching this on YouTube, she's got a beautiful palm tree scene behind her. And she just recently moved to Texas. But I'm just so excited to have Dr. Ashley Funk joining us today. And as always, this podcast is about empowering you with wisdom, insights, perspectives, so that you can live your best life. And we know that wellness comes from how you feel on the inside as well as the outside. And so today we're going to be talking about the inside. And so our topic today, how boundaries can lead to balance. And guys, I know a lot of you guys are busy. I know a lot of you probably struggle with this. So I hope you have a journal. I hope you're taking some good notes. If you're driving, listen to this a second time and take notes later. But again, I think this is definitely going to be an episode that you are going to really benefit from. But before we dive in, I want to share a little bit about Dr. Ashley Funk and who she is so that you can understand how crazy awesome this is to learn from her. So Dr. Ashley Funk is the owner of Paradise Psychology. And you know what? Ashley, I didn't ask you this before. So you have a doctorate of psychology, correct? Am I giving that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. And help me with this. You are, it says PLLC and Fort Worth. What is PLLC?
So Paradise Psychology PLLC. So it's like a professional limited liability company. So it's just
Perfect.
the type of company.
Okay, awesome. So she's an entrepreneur as well as a psychologist, and as a doctor of psychology in Fort Worth, Texas. She is a licensed psychologist. She specializes in the treatment of anxiety disorders. Guys, this is a huge topic today, as well as assisting caregivers with managing unwanted behaviors displayed by their children. Hello, I need that. My 4 kids, as you guys have heard me share before, a lot of work. Dr. Funk also thrives in helping individuals improve communication and establish healthy boundaries. Oh, I'm so excited to learn about that today, to lead a genuinely happy and balanced life. So that is who we're going to be learning from today. But before we dive into all of the meat and the potatoes of this podcast, we want to just get to know you a little bit, Ashley. So please just share a little bit about yourself, and then we will dive right into today's episode.
Yeah. So as you said, I live here in very hot Fort Worth, Texas. Can't even remember the last time we were in triple-digit weather. So hence the tank top today. I'm staying in nice air conditioning. So I also have 2 cats, which you will probably hear because for some reason, once they see the AirPods go in and the microphone come out, they will probably come in here and make some noise. Their names are Honey and Luna, so Tabby and a Siamese. And as you know, Siamese tend to be very vocal. So fun fact, the painting behind me is actually the inspiration for the name of my private practice. I purchased it when I lived in Florida during Hurricane Irma. So I evacuated to Alabama and I bought this painting to kind of try to take my mind off the fact that I was worried about potentially losing everything because I lived on the coast that Hurricane Irma hit. So this was kind of my little paradise and something pretty I could look at while I was panicking. So.
Wow, that's so, thank you so much for sharing that. And, you know, this is crazy. So my husband grew up with Siamese cats. Okay,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
another crazy connection with my husband, because I don't know a lot of people that have had Siamese cats. So that is crazy. So I hope we get to see them actually, because
Yeah.
that's very cool. Well, I told Ashley, I'm like, no worries, because as you guys have probably heard before, I have 4 crazy dogs that like to make an appearance or bark during the podcast too. So no worries at all. All right. Well, thank you so much for just sharing all of that. And we're ready to dive in. So the first question is, what is a boundary? Let's just kind of define that for people, and let's just hear your perspective on that.
Yes. So a boundary is a way that you define not only your expectations in a relationship, but also your limitations. So by setting a boundary, you let someone know what you expect of them, but you also let them know your limitations. So what you can do and what you can't do, or what you're willing to do or what you're not willing to do. And that is do and accept. So I'll throw that out there, like what you're willing to tolerate, what you're not willing to tolerate, what you're willing to accept, what you're not willing to accept. So defining those expectations, and keep in mind, a boundary works in a relationship with other people, but sometimes we also have boundaries with ourselves. So we have to know our own expectations for ourselves, expectations in relationships, our own limitations for ourselves, and limitations when we're dealing with other people.
Good. That's so good. And I know this is definitely, like I said, something that I struggle with. I'm a yes person, and I just like to say yes to everything, including myself. And I tend to pack too much into my day. So I'm excited to just hear more about this. So, when and why should we set boundaries, not only with other people, but also for ourselves?
Yes. So the rule of thumb when setting boundaries is to set them early. So in any relationship, you want to set those boundaries early, because if you don't set a boundary early, it's going to be more difficult to set it later. So keep in mind, we teach other people how to treat us. So if you have very rigid boundaries, you're going to know that that is going on, because you're going to be creating very distant relationships, whether it's physically distant, emotionally distant, intellectually distant, spiritually distant relationships, where you're kind of creating a wall and you don't have that intimacy. If you have very lax boundaries or non-existent boundaries, you are going to be the person that's always saying yes. You're overstretching yourself, and people are always going to be taking. So a lot of taking, you're giving a lot, you're going to be exhausted, you're going to be, like all your resources are being used up. So you want to have that balance. And keep in mind, people in general don't like change. So if you teach them, you're always going to say yes, or you're always going to say no, that is what people learn to expect from you. So if you go to establish those boundaries later in a relationship, it's going to confuse people, and they're going to be like, well, this is not who you are. Like, this is not how our relationship works. And it's going to be a lot more difficult, because people want to push things back to the way they used to be. And so if you create those healthy boundaries early in a relationship, they know what to expect, what is expected of them, but they also know what to expect from you.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's think about this for a second. So let's say that you don't establish them early. And so you are in this place where you're like, okay, I've got to set some boundaries. Like, this is just, taxing my sanity and things like that. So what is like a tip or a strategy of, like you said, it's going to be maybe awkward or uncomfortable, but it's a necessary thing that has to happen. Like, are there some certain like word choices, or how do you work with your patients and encourage them when they didn't do it early? Like, how do you suggest to them to do it maybe halfway or whatever?
So one of the things I always suggest is to make a list. So journal, write it down, make a list, like, write down, what are my expectations in my relationships? Or what are my limitations for myself? What am I willing to tolerate? What am I willing to accept? What am I not willing to accept? So like, what are those boundaries? And to start small. So, identify 1 to 3 boundaries that I want to begin implementing. Only, do one at a time. Get that going. Start small. Have those small successes, because if we go for like the big one and you don't stick with it, then it's going to be a lot harder, because you kind of have that knock to your self-esteem and you're like, oh, like that didn't work well. So start small, know what you want, and then kind of work our way up.
Yeah.
And with people, when they say like, oh, I don't like this, like, why are we doing this? Say like, I know you're used to me saying yes. However, I'm really overstretched, or I don't have the time to do this. I'm sorry. Just stick with it.
That's good. So in your practice, what are some of the biggest kind of boundary issues that your clients seem to be struggling with? I'm just curious, and maybe even share like obviously you can't give names or anything, but maybe kind of give an example of someone and kind of how you came alongside them and what you kind of did to help them.
So the biggest boundary issue I usually see is people that lack boundaries. So the pleasers, the people pleasers that overstretch themselves, can't say no, that maybe have tried to implement a boundary, it wasn't effective, and they're just like, I'm exhausted. Like I put myself on the back burner. I'm not taking care of myself because I'm taking care of everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we do is we say, okay, so what is a boundary that you can put in place right now? And how are we going to be assertive and stick with it and identify, if this person pushes that boundary and breaks it, what is the consequence of doing that? And making sure that the individual is in a place of empowerment to put that consequence in place, knowing it might be broken. Because if we put a boundary in place and a person breaks it, but then we don't do anything about it, it's not actually a boundary.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah. And I definitely can relate to the people pleasing part. It's so weird because it's like, I don't really care what people think, but at the same time, I'm such a giver and I just love serving that's where sometimes, I get into trouble with boundaries. But I know for me, just even recently, just because, like I said, I'm a workaholic and I love to work hard and help others, but I've really had to set a boundary of, okay, Sundays, like I'm not working on Sundays. Like that is my day of rest. That is my day of just spending quality time with my family. And so that's something that, will I answer a text? Yes, but like I'm not like actively doing things for my business, that day. So that's been very helpful. So I'm just curious, and this, I hope I'm not throwing you a curveball with this, but so I know just in my life, I've kind of dealt with just narcissistic types of personalities. And, like you said, I think I wrote that down, like we teach other people how to treat us, right? And so, people that are huge hearted, they're big givers, right? I feel like they kind of are bigger targets for being taken advantage of, and especially by narcissists. So do you have any experience with either working with narcissists or with, I don't want to say victims, but people that are in those relationships? Because I've dealt with that several times in my life, and it's hard. So I was just curious what your perspective is with that type of person.
Yes. So when you are establishing a boundary with a healthy individual, it's different than when you're dealing with somebody who themselves lacks the capacity to appreciate a boundary. So someone who maybe is a habitual boundary breaker, which may be seen as someone who has narcissistic traits. So when I work with individuals who have, like, they may have a family member, a friend, someone at work who has narcissistic traits, which is something we will like discuss and say, oh, these are maladaptive relational patterns. This individual is, we're 99% certain they're going to break every boundary you try to set. That is when the consequences have to be very clear and very consistently put in place. and probably more severe. So these are things like you are clear, specific, assertive in stating things, an example being you're on the phone with a family member who has a tendency to be use degrading language or insulting language or like being highly critical. You don't need to be on the phone listening to that. Like that is not your responsibility, or like that is not for you to have to listen to. So if somebody starts being highly critical or being insulting, you state once, I do not appreciate you speaking to me in that manner. And if you continue, I'm going to hang up the phone. They keep doing it, click. That's a boundary.
That's so good. No, that's so good. And I know that's hard, but again, to your point, like you have to be really stern, I think, in those situations. And, and I bet too, and I'm a little bit older than you, 51. So I've lived a little bit more life and dealt with people and, what I do for a living, from being a teacher to what I do now, like, I'm in relationship business. And so, I'm sure a lot of our listeners deal with people every day, whether it's their job, their family, friendships. So I know one of the biggest things that, I try to really minimize, and I even deal with this with my daughter who's about to turn 16, is about you are who you surround yourself with, and about toxic relationships, like toxicity, meaning, talking bad about other people, drama, you know what I mean? So what if, someone who's listening, has a great friend or has someone in their family who they love them, but like every time they're around them, it's like they're just talking crap about other people, or they just feel like it's just life sucking and they don't want to not be a good friend. But like, how do you help people handle just toxic type relationships? Like it's not maybe a narcissistic situation, but it's still, I hope I'm making my point clear with that, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes that's where that boundary for yourself comes into play, of sometimes, a boundary that is good for us is limiting contact.
Mm-hmm.
And if we know that there's a person in our lives that when we have contact with them, it is negative energy, and it is not positive energy. So I use an analogy with people of like, there are people in your life, you have a bucket, and there are people in your lives that fill your bucket, and there are people in your lives that are holding a drill and they're drilling holes in your bucket and emptying all the water.
Yeah.
You want to surround yourselves with people that fill your bucket or have corks, stopping up the holes. You don't want to fill your life with people that have the drills that are drilling the holes in the bottom. Yeah. And sometimes, if it's somebody close that you're like, we sometimes have people in our lives that are like, well, we can't cut that person out for one reason or another.
Right.
Fine. But can we limit contact? Or is there, are there certain things that we're okay talking about X, Y, and Z, but if that conversation, digresses into something else, how do we end that conversation? Or how do we, say like, oh, sorry, gotta go, or, how do we have an out? Yeah. And those are boundaries as well. Boundaries are in all the different ways. We have physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, intellectual boundaries, spiritual boundaries, sexual boundaries. We have all sorts of boundaries that we can establish.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. So now that you've kind of talked about just the different types, and I think for today's purpose, we're kind of really focusing on just maybe relationship type boundaries and just personal boundaries, right? So what are some tips? I know you've already given us a couple of great ones, but do you have any additional tips to help our listeners when it comes to setting those effective boundaries? What are some suggestions with that?
Yeah, so be clear and specific. The more lengthy your statement is, the more convoluted and complicated it's going to be. Your message is going to get lost, in other words.
Yeah.
So state what you expect, or state your boundary clearly, specific, make it brief, short and sweet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And don't assume the other person can read your mind. If you don't say it, they don't know it.
Yeah, that's true. That's good.
And, consequences don't have to be complicated either. And with some boundaries, consequences only matter if they matter to the other person. So a consequence that matters to you may not matter, to him, her, them.
Yeah.
And expect the other person, if it's especially if it's a boundary that's not set early, expect the other person to potentially push back. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we have that gut instinct of like, oh, I did something wrong. This is bad. No, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. That is just a normal human reaction to change.
Yeah, that's good. Well, and so let's take it to a more personal level within ourselves. So what do you think, just, and again, working with your clients, what do you consider or what do you recommend to people are good, healthy personal boundaries? I'm just curious, what are some, tips and strategies that give to people when it comes to how they treat themselves and just personal boundaries?
So I think this varies person to person. And I think you just have to know what your own limitations and what you are willing to accept or tolerate. And I think that's such an individualized thing. That being said, I think we have a tendency as human beings to not take care of ourselves as much as we should in general. Self-care for some reason, or, for some reason we just say, oh, being selfish is bad. And I always tell my clients, I'm like, selfish is not a bad word. Society says it is. A lot of times, we just hear that message, like, oh, you're so selfish. And we think, that's bad. Being selfish is not bad. Sometimes you need to be selfish. It's that whole thing of, if you've ever been on an airplane and they talk about if the mask drops down, you need to put it on yourself before you put it on the person next to you, like the kid next to you. That is life. You have to take care of yourself if you want to take care of somebody else.
That's so good. That's like a mic drop moment there, Dr. Funk. I'm not kidding. Selfish is not a bad word. That is so good. And I think you're right. I think it's one of those expressions that is so misinterpreted, you know what I mean, by people. And yeah, I think that's so good. Well, and even just like me yesterday, I mean, I had a crazy busy day, did a couple podcast episodes and had a lot of work, but I was like, okay, I need to go over to the beach for an hour and just unplug and, have that me time so that I can come home and have a better attitude around my children before I make dinner and do all of the things. And so again, if I wouldn't have snuck off and taken that hour for myself, who knows, what could have erupted. But so again, yes, self-care, super, super important. So, I know you talked a lot about setting these boundaries, being very specific and keeping them simple, but obviously boundaries do get broken. So how should a person handle that or respond when boundaries are broken? Because they are going to be broken, unfortunately.
Yes. So first things first, you always want to start your response when you're calm. So if a boundary is broken and you feel yourself feeling very frustrated, very angry, that is not the time to respond. Because when we are feeling very emotional, we have a tendency to act on urges that, quote unquote, we use our emotional mind and we may not make the best decisions, and then things escalate and nothing comes, nothing is productive at that point. So we want to be using our more logical, calm, cool, collected mind. And there is a phrase that I always write down for all of my clients, and I'm like, use this, or something similar to this. And it is, I feel, insert the emotion, when you, what the person said or did, because insert consequence it has on you. And then follow that with, instead, I would like you to say what you expect of them or what you want them to do.
Okay. I'm writing this down because that's so good. Well, and hang on, I would like you to. So I feel, then they plug in their emotion when you, and then put in what the person does, because what the consequences to you, because they did that, right? Instead would like you to, and then what that would be. That's super helpful. Yep. Well, and and it's so true, because I think too, and I've, again, this is something as I've gotten older, I've been doing a better job with, but I used to be a quick reactor, right? And so, like you said, I mean, if your emotions are high, you're going to say things that you're going to later regret. You're going to act in a way that you're, again, going to possibly regret. And so taking that time to kind of cool down, and maybe doing an exercise like that, you know what I mean, where you fill that in, you have a reflection moment. I think that's super, super important. And, and I think this kind of segues into something that I think a lot of people maybe deal with today, and that is social media. A lot of people are active on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. And unfortunately, sometimes people can get on our pages and get kind of nasty. And so like, that's a great example of, even setting boundaries when it comes to social media. Do you have any tips or advice for people with that, with social media? So I'm just curious about that.
So, I'll kind of share on a more personal note. I have personal boundaries that I have with social media. And a lot of those are, if I have not personally met the individual, or my fiance has not personally met the individual, I will not accept their friend request. I don't care who you are. I'm not accepting it.
Yeah.
And, I remember back, I joined Facebook when it was only for college kids. So back in, long time ago. And it used to be a thing like, how many friends can you have? And I still have, friends from college who have like over 500.
Yeah.
And, I sit and I think, what truly is the purpose of social media? Is it really about connecting anymore?